Okay. Well, if I'm a lawyer, lawyers mostly deal with individual cases or cases involving groups of people and are concerned about the outcomes of legal processes for individuals, usually for defendants they represent, sometimes for the victims, sometimes for other people. And that's really, really important. And to some extent, when Dan said that I'm going to talk about, I guess, the justice issues, that's what he had in mind, that I might talk about some of these questions of how should legal systems deal with individual offenders in some just and measured way. Actually, and our moderator suggested there was a sequence here that we're going to go from the broad to the narrow. Actually, we're broadening out again. My belief is that these individual issues, incredibly important as they are, if somebody goes to prison for 10 years or 25 years or life and it's unjust, that's terrible. And we put people through programs of the sort that Friedrich talks about, and it's the wrong program, or it's ineffectively run, or it has a much less efficient or effective outcome than it ought to, and that's a great social waste. So at the individual level, all these things are really important. But the thrust of this talk is that all of those issues are at the wrong level of analysis if we want to understand crime and prevention of crime and violence in societies. So this presentation really fits more with Eisner's and with Rotman's and with half of Sherman's when he was talking about less developed societies. So I want to ask you to think for a minute about the picture that Manuel put on the board on the screen yesterday when he showed 8 centuries of decline in homicide rates in 5 or 6 regions of Europe. Now there are 2 things about that slide, and I'm going to show it to you again, or a version of it, that I think are really important. The first is, within this just geographically bounded area that shares, in a big picture sense, a lot of common culture, there was a common pattern over many centuries of declining use of personal violence resulting in death. And by the time we got to 1900 or 1925, all of these Western Europeans, countries except for Finland, which is a bit higher, had homicide rates of about 1 per 100,000. So something similar happened, but the timing was different. There were lags in it happening. But the second thing is the timing was different. Now, nobody really has a good explanation for why homicide rates fell by 30 times in 8 centuries. Some people talk about a German sociologist named Norbert Elias who said there was a civilizing process and human beings became less violent and less confrontational and so on. But there's the next question, well, how come did that happen? And the usual explanations invoke state formation, the state reservation of control over the use of punitive power, modernization, urbanization, bureaucratization, the development of mass institutions in the 19th and 20th centuries that shaped people to play roles in them and the 2 important points, the same trends happened everywhere, but at very different times. In this talk, here's the takeaway. The takeaway is, the first one, important as Dan's issues and Friedrich's issues and half of Larry's issues are, they are epiphenomenal to understanding what's happening with crime in society. What the criminal justice system does has relatively little to do with that. The second is choices about punishment practices and policies. Do we invest more in community penalties? Do we allocate more to police than we do to prisons? Do we have huge imprisonment rates as in the US or modest ones as in Scandinavia? Those are the result of choices by people with political authority to make those choices, and they make them. And they are reflections of the culture and history of the place and the people who made them. The third is, though, and this now does build more, but goes beyond Manuel, that in developed Western countries, which is why I said that in green, crime rates and patterns move in parallel for everything. That is, homicide is a leading indicator not only for assault, which it ought to be, but for robbery and for rape and for burglary and for theft and some other things. And I'm going to show you some things that I think show that. Unfortunately, it's developed Western countries because we just don't have the data to do the kinds of analyses I'm going to show you. In other countries, and the last one is that for countries that have moderately humane criminal justice systems, really low imprisonment rates, that don't have large quantities of very severe, harsh, symbolic penalties, the characteristics of those countries are the same as the characteristics of low crime rate countries. And they are things about civil society and democracy and legitimacy and trust and functioning government and so on. So those are going to be the 4 takeaway points. This is the cover of a book that Manuel's presentation came out of. This is his article that he stuck into the packet for the conference. This is a 5 or 6 year project that grows out of different literature that was very active for about 15 years, in which people were trying to understand initially why did the American justice system become so vastly more punitive. And then they were trying to understand, well, okay, Americans did that, but why didn't the Germans do the same thing? And why at the same time did Finland reduce its imprisonment rate by 2/3? And so there was a very robust literature from the mid-90s to about 2008, which has pretty much run its course, and there's pretty general agreement that we know some answers about the questions of why countries have very substantially different criminal justice policies. That is why policymakers choose. Now, this is a very famous set of slides initially developed by Tapio Lapiseppala, who's probably the most influential person who wrote in this explaining punishment policies literature. And it shows, for 60 years, imprisonment rates, and I apologize to Suzanne, who I'm sure has seen this slide 27 times, 10 by Tapio and 15 by other people like me who've stolen it from me, but with permission. It shows that the Finns, between 1950 and 1990, chose to reduce their imprisonment rate by 2/3, from 180 to 60. At a period when the other 3 larger Scandinavian countries are sort of wobbling in the same range. And now you can see for the last 20 years, the 3 countries have been indistinguishable with imprisonment rates, including pretrial, of about 70 per 100,000. This is the slide that's always emphasized. So with the one on the right, which is total crime rates per 100,000 for those 4 countries, Tapio would always say, when he made this presentation, well, look, we reduced our imprisonment rate by 2/3, and now if you look at the aggregate crime rates for those 4 countries in the same 60-year period, you will see that the relationship of the Finnish crime rate to those of the other 3 countries didn't change. This does not mean that Sweden has the highest crime rate. These countries measure crime in somewhat different ways. Some don't count small property crimes, for example. But they've done it relatively consistently over all these years. So usually we emphasize the left figure, but I'm emphasizing the right figure, and that's the origin of this book that I waved at you. Trying to understand, okay, if we think we can explain why Sweden has the kinds of policies it does in Germany and Finland and America and Canada, how do we understand why countries have different crime rates? Now, if you look at this slide, it seems to me there are 2 things that stand out. The first one is whoops, sorry. There's a pointer here somewhere. What did I do? I don't know where the pointer is. So I guess I can't use it. Is that the pointer? No. Okay, well, here's the pointer. Here's the pointer. The first thing is they're all going up in general. But more important, if you look at them, when they have little jumps up, they all have little jumps up. When they have jumps down, they all have jumps down. When they have jumps up, they go up, and they The patterns move in parallel for 60 years. Now, this is just aggregate crime, so it includes lots of little assaults and lots of little thefts and things. But the patterns are common. Now I'm going to show you a different slide, just to make the same point in different countries. This is the US and Canada comparing prison rates and homicide rates and robbery rates over